Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This essay began as an attempt to understand why an interview with Jane Goodall, conducted on a podcast known more for pop feminist therapy than anthropological depth, felt quietly devastating. It wasn't what was said that lingered, it was what was permitted. The tone, the silences, the restraint, the way pain was allowed to speak but never disrupt. What emerged was not a critique of Jane, nor a dismissal of the host, but something more unsettling, a recognition of how deeply our platforms have learned to narrate harm without confronting its origin. This is the new miseducation, not of facts, but of feeling. In tracing Jane's voice across the episode, what appears is not simply the story of a woman who overcame loss through discipline or scientific clarity, but the story of a culture that taught her, and now teaches us, to convert abandonment into insight, restraint into virtue, and narrative coherence into a stand-in for truth. The podcast becomes a case study in emotional choreography, how to survive hurt without threatening the listener's comfort, how to speak of loss without indicting the systems that produce it. What's at stake here is not just therapeutic culture, but the ethics of legibility itself. Who decides what kind of emotional truth is safe to share? What forms of grief are narratively permissible? And what does it mean to become fluent in the performance of pain rather than the experience of it? This essay is not an exposé. It's a refusal. A refusal to accept that well-told stories are always honest ones. A refusal to let resolution stand in for reckoning. And most of all, a refusal to keep learning the emotional rules of a culture that has made miseducation its most elegant product. It follows the silences, not the statements. It listens for the absences that shape the shape of what is said. And in doing so, it asks, what if the real lesson we've been taught is not how to heal, but how to not disturb? There is no audience in this episode, only witnesses. And that difference matters, because witnessing requires a kind of exposure that audiences are rarely asked to endure. It demands that we not only receive what is said, but confront the frameworks that made its saying necessary. In the case of Jane Goodall, what we are witnessing is not simply her story, but the sediment of cultural conditioning that shaped how her story could be told. The restraint, the translation of pain into professionalism, the seamless arc of survival into legacy, all of it feels rehearsed, not by her, but by the world that needed her to sound like that. At its core, this is an essay about form, not the story of Jane, but the architecture that encased it. The genre of the podcast, the language of therapeutic revelation, the marketability of measured grief. These aren't just mediums, they are emotional containment systems. And once we see them, we can't unsee the toll they take on the speaker, on the listener, on the very possibility of knowing one another honestly. When Jane talks about her childhood, there's a perceptible modulation in tone, a distancing. Not cold, but careful. It's as though the words arrive already pre-processed, ready for broadcast. This isn't a failure of Jane's authenticity. It's a triumph of the machine that taught her which parts of herself could be safely made public and which could not. The host, in her role as facilitator, mirrors this performance. She asks the right questions, she receives the answers with reverence, she nods in all the places that signal comprehension. But what she doesn't do, what the format can't permit, is challenge the symmetry. To ask, what would this story sound like if it were allowed to unravel? Who might Jane be if her restraint weren't valorized but mourned? And who are we, the listeners, in this structure? We're not complicit in the usual way. We haven't demanded a happy ending, but we've accepted coherence where there should be contradiction. We've taken the comfort of narrative symmetry as evidence of healing. And in doing so, we've missed the point. This isn't about dissecting Jane's life. It's about understanding what happens to a voice when a culture demands its legibility more than its truth. She says it softly, almost as if she knows the words will echo in places they shouldn't. I didn't really feel anything at the time. Jane Goodall, not the icon, but the girl left behind, recounts the moment her father vanished from the family home. And in that disarming sentence, so ordinary, so non-performative, something slips. Not just a memory, but a template. The template of how millions learn to misrecognize abandonment as strength, adaptation as growth. The deeper theme of this episode is not about chimpanzees or even fame, but about what happens when the parent goes missing. and the culture calls it resilience. We begin here because the voice of daddy and what it becomes in the hands of mass intimacy has been entirely misread. The podcast that hosts her, Call Her Daddy, is not merely a cultural artifact. It's a surrogate school for effective ethics, dressed in confessional aesthetics. It trains women in how to narrate their abandonment without disturbing the structures that caused it. Jane's presence doesn't break this pattern, it perfects it. The wounded girl becomes a priestess of regulation, and the podcast, masked as empowerment, becomes a church for stories that remove you from yourself while promising closeness. This is the anatomy of a cultural trick, platform as parent. We don't just listen to the show, we enter its emotional governance. Its structure replays a trauma loop with production polish, the longing, the confession, the almost breakthrough, the dignified exit. It's therapy theatre performed without rupture, no shame allowed to leak, no miseducation confronted. Jane talks of her absent father with curiosity, not grief. But somewhere between the lines, you can hear a girl who had to make sense of loss without an adult translator, a girl who, in making animals legible to science, rendered her own hurt illegible to herself. In this essay, we are not interested in attacking the host, nor in sanctifying the guest. What we are tracking is something quieter and more viral, the cultural codex for how to manage miseducation. When love disappears, who teaches you what intimacy should feel like? And what happens when that teacher is a monetized mirror feeding your pain back to you in palatable doses? There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows a perfect answer. It's not peace, it's obedience. When Jane responds to the host's questions, there's often a pause, not of reflection but of restraint. The shape of her voice doesn't falter, but it folds inward, pulling back the complexity like a curtain that shouldn't be opened too wide. This isn't the silence of wisdom. It's the silence of someone who learned long ago that too much truth makes people uncomfortable. Especially if that truth concerns the failures of those we were supposed to love, or worse, the institutions that claim to help us understand them. Across the arc of the episode, what emerges is not the story of a woman who overcame, but the trace of a society that rebranded survival as character. The underlying trauma, the disappearance of her father, the remaking of emotional bonds with chimps, the escape into observation, remains largely uninterrogated. Not by accident, but by design. This is where the deeper miseducation reveals itself. Therapy talk without therapeutic consequence. The episode circulates in a cultural loop where vulnerability is licensed only when it can be commodified, where grief must come pre-edited, and where healing is sold as personal insight rather than social critique. Jane says she preferred animals to people. The host nods. Millions nod with her. But what's being nodded into place is the idea that choosing detachment is a kind of wisdom, that opting out of messy, unreliable humans is a noble move, not a protective wound. No one stops to ask, what does it cost a child to replace connection with observation? What happens when the safest intimacy is one you can't be hurt by because it can't speak back? In this way, Jane's legacy becomes both extraordinary and tragic. Not because she failed to confront her pain, but because the platforms that now elevate her voice were never designed to hold pain in its raw, unruly form. They want a version of pain that uplifts, that flatters, that sells. So when she reflects on her life, what we get is a calibrated narrative of strength without rupture, curiosity without anger, insight without rage. It's not that Jane is hiding, it's that the medium has already decided what parts of her can be shown. The episode teaches us how to behave inside a culture that fears emotional chaos. It asks us to admire women who survived the unnameable by becoming experts in legibility. But underneath that polish, something aches. And if you listen closely, it's not Jane you hear. It's every daughter who turned her wound into a science. Midway through the episode, there's a moment where Jane recounts her time in Gombe, surrounded by chimpanzees away from the world of humans. It's offered as an escape, a sanctuary, maybe even a kind of rebirth. But beneath the awe and anthropological detail lies a quiet displacement, the substitution of gaze for closeness, of study for touch. What the episode never quite allows to surface is the possibility that her pioneering work was not just a calling, but a survival strategy. When human intimacy becomes unreliable, observation becomes a form of control. and science in its most seductive form becomes an effective firewall. This is where the miseducation deepens. We begin to believe that understanding something is enough to hold it. The episode drifts into a familiar cultural posture, admiration without accountability. Jane's story is rendered mythic, not just because of what she did, but because of how well it fits the template. Woman transcends hardship through intellectual mastery. But in accepting that arc, we miss the quiet warning nested in her voice, that sometimes we turn life into data because life, when felt too directly, would destroy us. The host follows her lead, gently but persistently circling the safer narratives. There's admiration, sure, even reverence, but no genuine rupture. No interruption that might force a reckoning with the emotional substrata of Jane's legacy. Instead, the platform chooses fluency over friction. Insight becomes a smooth surface. There's no blood under the brilliance. The intimacy here is stylized, not lived. This is the great paradox of the therapeutic era. We speak of healing constantly, but only in terms that don't threaten the platforms that package it. In this episode, healing becomes an aesthetic, paced, polite, profound in tone, if not in risk. And that's precisely what makes it dangerous, because it teaches a generation not how to feel, but how to narrate feeling in ways that are recognizable to an audience, but estranged from the self. Jane's reflections on the natural world become unintentionally a metaphor for emotional exile. She watches life, records it, names its patterns, but rarely does the episode allow us to see whether she ever found language for her own. It's as if her voice, so admired for its clarity, has been trained to skip over the scenes that might invite chaos. And in a culture that rewards insight without breakdown, this restraint is not a flaw, it's a feature. A system that rewards the well-tempered survivor over the disobedient witness. The deeper lesson is not about chimps or childhoods, but about what gets trimmed out of every public conversation about pain. We are not just miseducated about love. We are miseducated about what it means to grieve properly. It's easy to mishear this episode as a triumph narrative. Jane rises, Jane leads, Jane teaches the world. But triumph in this context is a misdirection, not because Jane hasn't achieved extraordinary things, but because what we're being invited to admire is the management of loss, not its confrontation. The framing subtly enforces an emotional model that rewards regulation over reckoning. This isn't empowerment, it's narrative compliance. It asks women to become articulate survivors, to tell stories that do not disturb the platforms that amplify them. The host's questions hover near insight but rarely puncture the emotional membrane. There's a choreography to the exchange, vulnerability framed in digestible metaphors, trauma rinsed clean of contradiction. It's a pattern perfected across 1,000 episodes in the Therapeutic podcast industrial complex. Locate pain, narrate resilience, extract wisdom. But what happens when wisdom is a form of detachment? When we package raw emotion in such refined language that we no longer feel it? At several points, Jane hints at deeper breaks, moments of alienation, of unresolved grief, of recursive displacement. But these moments are gently redirected, folded back into the script of growth. It's as if there's an invisible editing mechanism, not in the studio, but in the culture itself, deciding what kinds of stories are safe to finish. The result is an emotionally stable product. And the danger of emotional stability as product is that it becomes the template for legitimacy. If your pain isn't calm, quotable, and narratively aligned, it's suspect. What are we being trained to hear? Not the contradictions, not the silences, but the carefully assembled montage of acceptable wounds. The episode becomes a case study in epistemic grooming, where the listener is taught not just what to feel, but how to interpret the emotional signals of others through platform-approved schemas. Jane's dignity is real, her restraint is practiced, but what we've come to call dignity in public storytelling often emerges from a survival mechanism. Don't show too much, don't break the form, don't bleed on the audience. What this does over time is recode trauma as taste, recasts what is unhealed as narratively satisfying. And so pain becomes a genre and healing becomes its resolution even when none has occurred. To unlearn this is hard. It means refusing the applause that comes from perfect telling. It means letting stories fall apart mid-sentence. This episode doesn't do that. It can't. The format won't allow it. But the listening does shift when you realise what's been left out. Not because Jane failed to speak, but because the system she spoke into had already decided what parts of her story were permissible. There's a curious alignment between the structure of the episode and the structure of avoidance. Both unfold with precision, pacing revelations, as if the listener were a child who must be protected from too much meaning at once. But what if the very point of these stories is not revelation but delay? What if the episode is less about what is said and more about what it teaches us to wait for and never receive? The deferred grief, the postponed rupture, the emotional truth always just out of reach. This is not an accident of editing, it is the architecture of miseducation. By presenting restraint as maturity and composure as insight, the episode furthers a pedagogy of emotional regulation masquerading as self-awareness. The guest's voice, the host's affirmations, the gentle swells of background music all serve to cocoon the listener in a version of intimacy that never risks collapse. The result is a sense of learning without destabilization, reflection without reorientation. It feels profound. But like many things that feel profound, it achieves its effect by bypassing contradiction rather than moving through it. At one point, Jane remarks that her mother accompanied her on her earliest trips, acting as a kind of moral ballast. The detail is small but revealing. The presence of the mother stabilizes the absence of the father, creating a balance that allows Jane to venture into the wild without entirely falling apart. Yet the episode does not linger here. It passes over the role of the mother quickly, missing the chance to explore how female care is often mobilized as infrastructure in the lives of those who later become iconic. This is part of the miseducation too. We erase the scaffolding, then praise the survivor for standing alone. What the format refuses is precisely what the content demands, a reckoning with the emotional logic that underpins our admiration. We admire Jane because she appears untouched by bitterness, unseduced by grievance. But what if this is not a triumph of character, but a side effect of having never been permitted to express rage? The platform rewards her for coherence, for the ability to turn pain into clarity. But clarity is not healing, it is merely legibility. And in this way, the episode teaches us not only how to hear Jane, but how to edit ourselves, to perform pain in a manner that is admirable, not disruptive, to construct our emotional narratives around the preferences of a listening culture that confuses polish with depth and restraint with integrity. This is the algorithmic ethic of therapeutic media. Never too much, never too raw, always return to order before the credits roll. In the end, what we learn is not about Jane's wounds, but about our own hunger for a version of healing that doesn't ask us to feel anything dangerous. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.